The royal flush, that wasn't you, rewalking through a castle. Stone walls tower above you, torches flicker. You passed through archways once, walked by kings and queens. Everything feels regalant, it hits you. A smell, faint, rancid, like rotting meat and wet mud. You glance around, and there, carved into the stone wall, is a small hole. Not a window, not a shelf, a toilet. Welcome to the Garderobe. Because while the medieval world gave us cathedrals, armor, and the printing press when it came to going to the bathroom, it was downright horrifying. Let's be clear, there was no running water, no flushing, no scented candles. In fact, castle toilets weren't even rooms. They were holes, sometimes over a moat, sometimes over a pit, sometimes just over open air. They sat on cold stone slabs with little more than a curtain to hide their dignity. The servants, lucky if they had a bucket today, were pulling back the velvet curtain and diving straight into the most awkward, disgusting, and shockingly clever ways people went to the bathroom in castles. Because nothing says noble blood quite like pooping 50 feet above a drawbridge. What is a garderobe? You've heard the word before, maybe in a history book, maybe whispered during a castle tour, but few know what it really means. Garderobe. To the medieval noble, it was their bathroom. To us, it was a glorified poop chute in the wall, literally. A garderobe was a small narrow room, often built into the thick castle walls. It had a stone bench with a hole cut into it. That hole, it dropped ways straight down a vertical shaft that led to the outside of the castle walls, or worse, directly into the moat. That's right, castles with moats didn't just use them for defense, they also became sewage systems. The design was brutal but functional. Gravity did the work. No pipes, no plumbing, just a drop and a prayer. The smell, overwhelming. No air fresheners, just a draft of cold air rushing in from the shaft and the occasional whiff of decay rising back up. To help with the stink, nobles sometimes hung their clothes inside the garderobe. Yes, inside the toilet room. The logic. Fumes from the waste would kill lice hiding in the fabric. Imagine walking into your bathroom and finding someone's royal robe hanging next to the hole. That was fashion meets function, medieval style. But garderobes weren't just for individuals. Some castles had rows of them, stacked one above the other in multi-story towers called latrine towers. If you were lucky, you sat at the top. If not, well, gravity wasn't your friend. And if you think the danger was just the smell thing again, castle attackers sometimes climbed up garderobe shafts to sneak into fortresses. Some poor guards even had to clean them out. So next time you flush a toilet with the press of a button, just remember, medieval nobles sat on stone thrones with their capes flapping in the breeze, trying not to fall into their own waste. Royal, indeed. Bathroom. Habits of the nobilitude. Think kings and queens had it better when it came to their bathroom business, and in some ways, they did, but that didn't mean it was pleasant. Royalty often used garderobes that were built higher in the castle, away from the stench of lower levels. Some even had double-seater thrones. Yes, double. Not for romantic reasons, but for gossip. Because why not discuss war strategy while sitting side by side on stone toilets? In some castles, the king's personal garderobe had a wooden seat, luxury. Some had curtains for privacy. Rarer still, some were near the kitchens, so the waste heat would warm the seat. But here's the strange part. Castles were cold. The toilets were colder. And in winter, using the garderobe could be like sitting on a frozen rock. Literally. As for wiping, they didn't use paper. That was precious. Instead, nobles wiped with moss, linen scraps, hay, or sometimes the sleeve of an unlucky servant. Cleanliness wasn't about soap. It was about perfume and changing shirts. The nobility weren't cleaner. They just smelled nicer. So while they dined on roasted boar and mulled wine, their royal business often ended in a cold stone shaft, just like everyone else. The only difference? They did it with style. Castle sewage systems, where it all went. Let's talk plumbing? Or, more accurately, the medieval lack of it. When nature called in a castle, it had to go somewhere, and that somewhere wasn't always pretty. Most castles used chute systems built into the stone walls. Waste from garderobes would drop down a vertical shaft, sometimes straight into the moat, sometimes into a cesspit, and sometimes just onto the ground below. These chutes were called garderobe shafts or night soil channels, and they didn't have covers. That meant on a windy day, or a hot afternoon, the smell could drift right back up into the castle halls. Cesspits had to be emptied, regularly by hand. There were workers called gong farmers, men who were literally paid to climb into these pits and scoop out the filth. They worked at night, with torches, surrounded by methane gas. Yes, sometimes it exploded, and no, they weren't paid enough. Some castles built waste channels that led into rivers or moats, assuming the moving water would wash it away. It didn't. It just created open, reeking streams. Disease followed. And in times of siege, with no one allowed out of the castle, things got real. Bad buckets were dumped into corners. Pits overflowed. The air turned thick with ammonia and rot. Even the nobles had to hold their noses. So the next time you flush a toilet and it disappears like magic, remember back then, The only thing between you and a pool of waste was a hole in a rock in a long, dark tunnel. Chamber pots, servants, and night soilettes shift from stone castles to bedrooms and hallways. Because even if you were a noble, you still had to go medums in the middle of the night, with no time to run to a garderobe or outhouse. That's where the chamber pot came in. It was a simple ceramic or metal bowl, often decorated with royal crests or floral designs because, of course, if you're going to poop indoors, it should at least look elegant. These pots were kept under beds, in cabinets, or beside chairs. When nature called, you'd use one, sometimes in full view of others. Modesty wasn't always a concern in medieval times. In royal courts, nobles might even relieve themselves during meetings, behind a curtain, or in a designated corner called a close stool. And yes, people would keep talking like nothing happened. Once the deed was done, the servants took over. These were the night soilmen, low-ranking workers, tasked with emptying the pots into cesspits, rivers, or garden trenches. They were essential, yet invisible, and no, they didn't get clean gloves or buckets with lids. Just the stench and the weight of waste. In larger households, the smell could build up. Imagine dozens of chamber pots, each used multiple times a day, sitting in unventilated rooms. Perfumed herbs, flour, sachets, or incense were used to mask the odor, but it never worked for long. Sometimes, the waste was reused. That's right, human waste or night soil was often used as fertilizer. It was collected and spread across crop fields. Imagine biting into a medieval apple that grew in a slurry of human waste. Tasty. So yes, they had toilets, sort of, but for many, the chamber pot was the throne of choice, convenient, portable, and emptied by someone else. Moats, drawbridges, and poop funnels. When you think of a moat, you probably imagine a shimmering trench of water, circling a castle, like a royal necklace. Maybe you even picture crocodiles or drawbridges creaking open. But in reality, moats weren't just defense mechanisms, they were often full of poop. Here's how it worked. Many castles had their garderobe shafts or waste chutes lead directly into the moat. Human waste, food scraps, dead animals, and all kinds of garbage slid down stone tunnels and splashed into the water below. Over time, these moats turned into stagnant cesspools, thick with algae, slime, and a horrifying stench. People who lived near the castle claimed the air could burn your eyes on hot days. In some castles, it wasn't accidental. They designed the waste system to use the moat as a sewer, thinking the water would carry everything away. But with little circulation, especially in drier months, the waste just sat there and festered. So why not clean it? They didn't, because they didn't dare. Moats were dangerous. They were part of the defense. And in some twisted way, a moat full of sewage was even more terrifying to intruders. Imagine trying to scale a castle wall while standing knee-deep in someone else's waste. In fact, some castles leaned into adding extra waste chutes during sieges, just to make things worse for attackers. Even worse, some castle kitchens dumped their dishwater and slop into the same channels, meaning food preparation and human waste flowed through the same stone veins. Cross-contamination was a daily risk, and outbreaks of dysentery and cholera weren't uncommon. A drawbridge might have looked majestic, but directly beneath it, the moat was alive with bacteria, buzzing flies, and the runoff from dozens of castle occupants. Public latrines and the castle commons. Life inside a medieval castle wasn't just about nobles and knights. It was also home to hundreds of workers, blacksmiths, servants, cooks, stable hands, guards, and they all had to go. Somewhere was often the public latrine, tucked behind the stables, near the kitchens, or sometimes hidden behind thick castle walls. Communal toilets served the lower classes. These weren't fancy. They were essentially long wooden benches with holes cut into them, sitting over a pit or chute. There was no privacy, no dividers. You sat next to your fellow man, your pants around your ankles, and pretended not to notice the sounds and smells. These latrines could seat up to 10 people at once, like a strange, smelly social club. Gossip was common. So was disease. The pits below were cleaned infrequently, often only when the stench became unbearable, or the waste threatened to overflow. Until then, it simply festered. Servants were in charge of maintenance. They'd pour lime or ash into the pit to keep the smell down and slow the decay. But in summer, nothing helped. These public latrines were breeding grounds for flies, rats, and bacteria, and since hand-washing was rare, it's no surprise that disease spread rapidly within castle walls. Still, for the average castle worker, a seat on the public latrine was better than the alternative, squatting outside in the mud, exposed to the cold and prying eyes. So while the nobles had their garderobes and cozy stone benches, the workers shared a bench and hoped the pit beneath them didn't collapse. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Hygiene. Afterward, wiping like a medieval person. Let's get real. Using the bathroom is only half the story. The other half, what came after. And in a medieval castle, the concept of toilet paper didn't exist, but people still had to wipe. Somehow. So what did they use? The answer is, whatever was available for nobles. Wiping might involve soft linen cloths, which were used, washed, and reused. Sometimes, they used wool scraps or old bits of fabric. But this was rare and reserved for those with money to burn literally, as some nobles burned there. Used cloth afterward to prevent disease. For the average person, not so lucky. Moss, straw, hay, or leaves were common. You'd grab a handful and hope it wasn't prickly. If you were lucky enough to live near a river, you might use smooth stones or even handfuls of snow in winter months. And inside castles, especially near public latrines, you'd sometimes find buckets of water and communal rags each shared. These rags were dipped, wiped, and re-dipped. Hygiene wasn't the goal, just getting clean enough. Some historical accounts suggest the use of wooden scrapers, flat spatulas, carved for the task. Romans used them too, calling them tersoriums. But here's the disturbing part. Communal wiping tools were a thing, passed from one person to the next, barely rinsed. If that sounds disgusting, it was, and it spread disease like wildfire. Children were taught early to wipe with what nature offered. Adults made do. And if you think chafing was a modern problem, imagine wiping with dry straw during a freezing winter. In castles, especially during sieges, wiping options dwindled. People would use cloth scraps torn from old garments, or nothing at all. Illness often followed, so the next time you reach for a soft tupli roll, count yourself lucky, because back then, you were just as likely to wipe with moss from the wall as anything else. Gender and privacy. Who got to go alone? In a medieval world built on hierarchy and rigid roles, privacy was a luxury rarely afforded to most, especially when it came to going to the bathroom. Let's start with the obvious. There were no locks on garderobe doors. In many cases, there weren't even doors. A small alcove off the great hall or sleeping chamber, perhaps covered by a curtain if you were lucky, was all you got. But the real question was, who got to go alone? For nobles, it depended on status and gender. Lords might have some garderobes near their quarters, built into the stone walls and suspended above the castle's outer drain. These were sometimes nicknamed the king's seat or the privy tower. A lord might even have a servant accompany him, not to spy or assist, but to stand guard outside to keep away intruders or enemies. Ladies of the castle, privacy was even scarcer. Noble women often had to use shared facilities or rely on chamber pots in their bedrooms. In fact, for noble women, the concept of alone time in a castle, whether bathing or relieving themselves, was almost non-existent. Maids were nearly always present, not only for assistance but to protect their mistress's virtue and safety. As for the common folk, there was no pretense of privacy. Communal latrines were standard in village life. Even in urban areas, multiple families might share one outhouse. People often relieved themselves in yards, by walls, or over chamber pots dumped into ditches or streams. Gender didn't guarantee privacy, it mostly dictated how exposed you were. And yet, even in this raw openness, customs began to form. Men turned their backs to others while urinating. Women would angle themselves away from view. In public bathhouses, people grew accustomed to the communal nature of hygiene, but still, modesty was observed as much as possible. Medieval art even shows these moments with a strange mix of humor and humanity. Carvings of people squatting in corners, embarrassed faces painted in manuscripts, or women clutching long skirts while hovering above wooden seats. In castles, sometimes even the walls themselves offered small moments of escape. Garderobes were placed in turrets or tower corners, high and narrow, giving the illusion of solitude in a noisy world. But for most people in the medieval age, privacy wasn't about locks or closed doors. It was about timing. It was about hoping no one walked by. It was about turning your back, lowering your eyes, and pretending you were alone. Because in a castle built for war, worship, and work, there was barely any space left for modesty. What we can learn from medieval bathroom habits at first glance. Medieval bathroom habits seem laughable, primitive, even grotesque. But if you look closer, you'll see something else hiding beneath the chamber pots and garderobes. Adaptability, resourcefulness, and a relentless drive to make do with what little they had. Let's start with innovation. Castles didn't just stick holes in walls, they developed elaborate sewage chutes, piping systems made from clay or lead, and angled latrines to carry waste far from living quarters. It wasn't perfect, but it was engineering born out of necessity. Some castles even built garderobes to drop waste directly into rivers, or moats to keep the castle cleaner and to keep invaders from climbing up. And look at how they handled hygiene without soap, toilet paper, or modern medicine. They used moss, hay, rags, even snow. Wealthier folks had linen cloths soaked in rosewater. In public bathhouses, communal towels were the norm, but still, people tried to stay clean. They didn't always succeed, but they tried. Then there's social structure. The way you went to the bathroom said everything about who you were. A noble's garderobe might be lined with herbs and lavender. A peasant might squat in a field. Even where you pooped was political. Castles were built to protect people, but not always their dignity. We also see the importance of routine. Chamber pots were emptied each morning. Garderobes were scraped, scrubbed, and occasionally perfumed. Even in times of war or plague, people still cared about keeping clean spaces. But perhaps the most important thing we can learn is this: privacy and comfort are modern luxuries. The medieval world didn't offer much of either, and yet people survived. They raised families, fought wars, fell in love while sharing toilets with strangers and wiping with hay. So next time you close your bathroom door and turn on the light, be thankful. You're not squatting over a moat at midnight, clutching your cloak and praying for privacy in a freezing stone tower. You're living a dream your medieval ancestors couldn't have imagined, and all it took was 800 years. Asterisk.